Welcome to the third video in Be Positively Powerful, Overcoming Trauma Through a Focus on Resilience and Empowerment. In this video, I am going to address educator trauma and secondary traumatic stress. There are two kinds of trauma experienced by educators. The first is direct trauma. That's the adversities that educators may experience while they're at school or associated with their work as an educator. The second is secondary traumatic stress. This is the stress that educators feel because of the adversities that are being experienced by their students that those students are sharing or the educator becomes aware of. So you may recall this slide from the first video, the experience of trauma. Direct trauma is essentially being the victim of the situation, whereas secondary traumatic stress is learning the details of someone else's trauma. Let's talk about some of the forms of direct trauma before COVID, the kinds of trauma educators may have been experiencing. This could have included threats from students or parents, racism or homophobia directed at them, unsafe conditions in the school, bullying by parents or students, bullying by administrators, bullying by colleagues, cyberbullying by any of those groups, violent students, and very challenging students. A study done on workplace bullying for the National Education Association found that approximately 18% of teachers and 13.7% of ESPs reported they were workplace bullied by someone else at the school where they currently worked. Look at this perspective from teachers. They are receiving approximately the same level of bullying from parents, students, and administrators. Both teachers and ESPs are receiving a significantly higher level of bullying from other staff. We also have to raise the concern and absolutely address this of the direct trauma that educators experienced during the pandemic. Many educators felt as if they were considered expendable, that their life, their health could be sacrificed. They were also feeling unsupported. They didn't receive sufficient support to effectively use distance technologies or in many other ways. They were overwhelmed, required to spend a significant excessive amount of time in the preparation and delivery of instruction in a manner that was highly stressful and challenging to achieve success. And further, they were shamed and blamed by some political leaders, education leaders, parents, and the media for expressing concerns about their health, as well as their concerns about the damage that the stressful school environments would have on children. Continuing from the slide before, no, I could not fit this on one slide. Ignored. In too many states, districts, and schools, the voices of teachers were not solicited or heard, and they were pressured. There were profound pressures to be present in environments where they reasonably feared this could lead to serious illness or death of them or one of their family members. Profound loss, experiencing profound feelings of loss at not being able to be safely with their students, and profound guilt. The feelings of guilt because the instruction that they were able to provide could not be delivered as effectively as usual. So I live in the state of Oregon, and this is a word cloud that I created. I asked teachers how they were feeling about being required to return to school to teach. This is a site that went up online, An Anonymous Teacher Speaks. This is a collection of statements of thousands of teachers regarding how they were feeling about teaching during the pandemic. In conducting an informal qualitative analysis of these concerns, it really ended up being two major concerns. The first was lack of voice. It appeared that in too many states, districts, and/or schools, the ever-changing expectations for implementation efforts by teachers and classified staff were made without any meaningful involvement, without voice by those educators. I will note that this did not appear to be universal. In some districts and schools, the administrators were more fully engaged with their staff and gave them voice. The second concern was the expectation of martyrdom. Teachers and classified staff have always been expected to be martyrs, and the expectation that they would increase their martyrdom and do more and more and more during the pandemic, that expectation profoundly increased. Unfortunately, it does not appear that any of these adversities are going to disappear. We still have the continued, and now it appears expanded, concerns related to the pandemic, and there will likely be increased fights related to masking, vaccinations, distancing, quarantines, testing, and remote learning. We also have this expanded social unrest. The fights over racism and the rights of LGBTQ plus students appear to be increasing and have the potential of exploding next year in schools. There are expressed issues of concern of learning loss, huge fears that students are behind. Our former president, and we have to put this on the table, he is facing criminal investigations in 2 states and may be indicted next year, which is going to lead to some significant controversy in the nation and in our communities. And the threats of violence. One study showed that 28% of Republicans think that violence will be necessary to correct the path of this country. And then you put that into the context of the 2 things that they're concerned about, and one of those is protections related to COVID, and the other is the fights over racism and LGBTQ students. So on top of the concerns related to direct trauma, we have issues related to secondary traumatic stress. Secondary traumatic stress is the emotional distress that an individual feels when learning about the traumatic experience of another. So this is a form of trauma, and educators often experience secondary traumatic stress when learning of the traumatic experiences of their students. Let's think about student adversities before COVID-19. These are the kinds of adversities that students might share with their teachers. Trauma at home, the adverse childhood experiences we've talked about. Trauma in the community. Traumas associated in living in high poverty neighborhoods, including community violence, housing, food insecurity, unemployment, and limited opportunities. Traumas associated with status. Racial harassment, police violence, fearing deportation of loved ones, LGBTQ youth fearing family rejection, and intergenerational trauma. And trauma at school, being bullied or harassed, being sexually harassed, unfair and inequitable disciplinary actions, and hurtful treatment by school resource officers. As we must be aware, for many students, these kinds of adversities have increased. The trauma that they may have experienced at home or may be continuing to experience at home. The increased stress of their parents who faced pandemic challenges and other challenges that may be ongoing. The traumas that they've experienced in their communities. The high poverty neighborhoods experience greater illness and death, along with increased housing and food insecurity, unemployment, and feelings of hopelessness. Again, the traumas associated with status. Minority groups faced higher rates of illness and death, but were required to place their lives at risk as essential workers, and the Black Lives Matter movement has raised attention to racism and intergenerational trauma. And traumas at school. The challenges of feeling that they're behind, feeling they're to be blamed because they're behind, and returning to school from learning, which for some students, especially those who were being bullied or are neurodiverse, was actually more safe. There are other sources of distress. If students were in school and became distressed, educators could not safely physically comfort them. Some students in distance learning had simply disappeared, and educators were not able to check on their well-being. And students were sharing information about the challenges their families were having, the deaths they have experienced, and their heartbreaks. And this was occurring either while they were at school or online. The three most common symptoms of secondary traumatic stress appear to be re-experiencing. That the teacher, educator is consistently thinking about what the student is going through and empathically experiencing the distress of the student. The second is avoidance, emotional numbing, to try to stop thinking about what has happened or is happening to the student. And the third is negative cognitions, persistent negative evaluations of self and feelings of guilt for not being able to take away the pain being experienced by the student. The risk factors that have been identified for having increased challenges with systemic traumatic stress are the level of empathy. Empathic educators are more likely to be approached by students experiencing trauma and are more likely to feel the student's emotional pain. Past history of trauma. The trauma that a student is experiencing may bring up past history of trauma experienced by the educator. The nature of the trauma, the severity of the adversity, and the extent of distress experienced by the student is going to impact how the teacher is feeling. The level of resilience, the educator's inherent and learned ability to deal with stressful situations will impact how they are responding in these situations. And the experience and insight of educators. More experienced educators and those with insight into trauma and secondary traumatic stress are more able to respond effectively. School environmental factors are also an issue. Schools that provide greater support for educators who might experience secondary traumatic stress have these factors. They maintain a democratic environment where all educators feel they have voice. Note again the importance of educator voice. They foster open communications. They encourage educators to engage in self-care and maintain effective work-life boundaries. They've implemented school-wide trauma-informed practices, and they acknowledge challenges and celebrate success. This is the list of requirements that we need to expect in all schools for the next school year. So, what schools must do to support educators next year in relationship to secondary traumatic stress is to implement comprehensive trauma-informed practices, educate staff about trauma and specifically about secondary traumatic stress, identify and monitor direct trauma and secondary traumatic stress among staff through assessments, provide regular opportunities to discuss and address the concerns that come up, and establish formal strategies to provide peer support and mentorship for all educators. Continuing from the last slide, schools need to ensure a culture that supports staff resilience that includes fair leave policies, adequate benefits, and a physically safe environment. They need to establish and maintain a decision-making process that incorporates shared decision-making and educator voice, and ensure prompt and effective response to any student adversities that are reported by staff. This is a version of the same slide that I recommended if you're working with students, but this recommendation is now for if you are an educator. Give your feeling a name. I am feeling. Name the way in which you're feeling, and then describe why you are feeling this way. Because. Make sure you identify what is happening that is causing you to feel bad. Then think about what you can do to address how you are feeling so that you can become more happy. These are self-care activities. Also, determine whether there are any actions that you can take to address the why you are feeling this way. This is advocacy. So if there's something that you can do, think things through by yourself or with others in a team to create an action plan and then take action. Self-care strategies. This diagram may be something you recognize. The Be Positively Powerful strategies are strategies that educators can also use. Applying these strategies for you, do a friendship audit. Write down the names of people you can connect with, the ones who uplift you. And whenever you start feeling stressed, take the time to connect with a friend. Second, reach out to be kind. Strive to intentionally reach out to be kind to others at least 5 times a day. Note how this person felt and note how this made you feel. Use your strengths. Complete the VIA character survey to find out what your top strengths are, and then intentionally use one of your strengths each day. Also, use your strengths in problem solving and when advocating for improvements. Focus on the good. Plan for having good experiences. Take the time to enrich these good experiences by focusing on the good and intentionally absorbing the good feelings into your body. You could keep a gratitude journal by writing down each evening 5 good things that happened that day and send thank you notes. Be mindful. Spend time meditating each day. Use a meditation app or listen to a meditation audio. Strive to take daily walks in nature. Keep your personal power. Remind yourself to stand tall and walk with pride. Realize that while you cannot control much about what is happening, you can control how you feel about yourself, and you can engage in advocacy for yourself and for students. Think things through. Take time to think things through to figure out what to do in the circumstances that may be present. It's so very important to remember that you are important. Set your boundaries. If you're being pressured or are pressuring yourself to do too much, stop. Establish your priorities. Outline what you will be able to do within the context of your educational responsibilities. Talk with your students. Find out what they need most from you and seek to give them voice. And work with your colleagues and building leadership. Do all of the above as a team so that you can all take care of yourselves. This is more really specific information because I don't see this being provided to educators on the steps to take if you're being harassed or bullied by someone. If you are a member of a minority group, that is race, national origin, religion, LGBTQ+, or disability, and you're being treated badly by another school staff member, or are being sexually harassed by a school staff member, and this is interfering with your ability to do your work, this is a violation of your civil rights. Now, if you do not think the above groups apply to you, consider whether the bullying or harassment has reached the level where you are now suffering from a diagnosable mental health challenge. That means trauma, anxiety, depression, and this is interfering with your ability to do work. If so, with a diagnosis of a mental health condition from a mental health professional, you are now considered to have a mental health disability, and this bullying and harassment is a violation of your civil rights. These are the steps to take. Document in writing every incident that happens. What happened, where, when, who, and how this is negatively impacting you and your work. Get an appointment with a mental health professional to discuss the situation, and ask the mental health professional for a letter documenting what you have said and this professional's assessment of the harmful impact on you and your ability to work. This isn't imperative, but this will really strengthen your case. Provide this documentation to your union if you think this may be helpful. It may not be helpful if the person engaging in the bullying and harassment is in the same union. File a complaint with the appropriate department in your district. If the manner in which your district responds does not resolve the problem, especially if there's any retaliation, file a complaint with the agency in your state that handles employee civil rights. There is also advocacy that you can engage in to support your students, which is going to be much better than going, my God, this is happening to my students and I'm not sure I can do anything. So, for all forms of trauma, advocate for school-wide trauma-informed practices. Traumas in the home and community. Encourage the development of school and community programs to support families better. Traumas associated with status. Encourage social justice efforts in your school and community. Traumas in your students' homes. Determine if mandatory reporting is required, and identify what other supports can be provided to the family. And trauma at school. Assist students in reporting bullying or other schools to school leadership, and ensure that the school leadership effectively addresses these concerns. You may also be able to encourage student advocacy. Are there ways you can work with your students to engage in joint advocacy to make things better for all of them? Help your students to find and express their voice, either as individuals or in a group. Help them to think things through, to create and execute an action plan to address their concerns. Engage them in creative expression of what they are experiencing and how they are feeling. Teach them persuasive writing and encourage them to write and speak to decision makers. For educator advocacy, there has got to be a greater commitment to educator voice in all of our schools. Insist on a change in district and school management that embraces educator voice. Insist that a survey be conducted to assess school climate and concerns related to educator voice that emerged, or lack thereof, that emerged during the pandemic. Insist that a leadership team be formed to shift both the district and school management to embrace educator voice. Insist that actions to embrace educator voice be implemented in a manner that ensures continuous improvement, ongoing measurements of effectiveness, and then expand these activities to ensure community voice, engaging students and parents. But this has to start with educator voice. The unhealthy expectation and narrative of the wondrous martyr teacher must die. Teachers must not be expected to live a life of continuous self-sacrifice as the ideal. Teachers must set strong boundaries and say no to expectations that they will go above and beyond. Creating an imbalance in their homes and personal lives must never be the expectation ever again. Teachers must remember that if they personally fail to maintain appropriate boundaries, what they're doing is making it more difficult for other teachers to maintain those boundaries. The teacher who goes above and beyond should never again be considered the model. And school staff must be adequately compensated. Teachers need to start playing politics. Step into the fray of how decisions are made. In the first video, I discussed post-traumatic growth, positive change that results from having experienced more significant challenges, as educators have this year. And the outcome of post-traumatic growth is an increased sense of personal strength, closer relationships, deepening of spiritual life, new opportunities, greater appreciation of life, and engagement in a quest for social justice. So I want to leave you with these questions. How can you contribute to positive change as a result of having experienced increased direct trauma and secondary traumatic stress? What strengths have you gained? What insight have you gained? And how can you use your new strengths and insight to make life better for yourself and for others? Thank you for listening. These are my websites, embracecivility.org and bepositivelypowerful.com, with email at info@embracecivility.org.